Hello and welcome to this month's edition of the Geopolitical Futures Club's Podcast Plus. I'm Christian Smith. The earthquake in Turkey and Syria earlier this month has brought catastrophe to the two countries. Thousands are dead and millions have been displaced. But natural disasters like this also have a geopolitical impact. So in this month's Podcast Plus, we wanted to discuss how disasters can influence local and international politics. To do so, I was joined by our Director of Analysis, Allison Fedirka, and our Chief Operating Officer, Antonia, Colibasanu, as we looked at three case studies: the recent earthquake in Turkey and Syria, last year's catastrophic floods in Pakistan, and Argentina's ongoing 3-year drought. Allison, Antonia, thank you very much for coming back on Podcast Plus. Great to speak to you both again. I kind of wanted to start with a bit of a theoretical question before we jump into our sort of case studies that we're going to look at. And just sort of speaking at a high level, what role do you think disasters can play in geopolitics? You know, would we consider them to be driving factors, to be triggers for wider influences, wider events? What do you think? Allison, let me start with you.
So I think there's three characteristics that come to mind when we think of natural disasters or disasters in general. One is there's the idea of an immediate disaster versus a kind of like a train wreck coming or a longer term disaster, thinking the difference between, for example, an earthquake or a drought. The second thing would be to view them, I think, more as a variable that countries can't control. So you're constantly seeing countries reacting to these types of disasters, and to some extent they may be able to mitigate impact or warnings, but a lot of them are beyond country control at this point in time. And then the third thing I think about is the difficulty of integrating that into a geopolitical model. It can be done to some extent, especially after the fact, of thinking of what we think about in terms of what impact an event could have. But, we're not going to be able to predict when is the next tornado, for example, going to hit, and where is it going to hit, and what exactly is it going to strike. So there's a certain level of difficulty with that. And then even with the longer term type disasters or natural changes that we would be examining, again, we have models that we can look at for general trends, but integrating them precisely into what does it mean at this specific moment in time is very difficult to do.
Antonia, do you want to add anything to that?
Of course. Well, I would add that natural disasters are important when you're thinking critical infrastructure, and that goes for the military and the economic domains. Now, for the economic domains, it is pretty simple. Whenever a natural disaster happens, you need to look at how the effect of that natural disaster would impact the larger sectors. That is, energy, health, infrastructure, whatever that is very much needed for the usual life, for the basics. And going from there, you would need to look and build the model of that country considering the system of society. So that is basically having the geopolitical model that we work with whenever we are thinking about imperatives and national interests, pretty much put at the disposal of the sort of a new system that you form into your head when a natural disaster hits. So you basically look at how will politics be affected by this? How will the economics be affected by this? Does this have anything to do with the way that a country can defend itself now? If we're talking about a major conflict in the nearby area, for instance, that might be the case. The second element that goes with natural disasters is the way that a natural disaster is able to build bridges in terms of humanitarian help, in terms of building up relations between countries that were not necessarily there, or we're there, but not at the level that the countries may have wanted them to be. So an example that comes to mind is the attitude that Sweden had when the earthquake in Turkey happened, right? So the two countries were having a sort of a diplomatic conflict, but when the earthquake happened, Sweden took the chance and basically started building bridges with Turkey. Now, we don't necessarily have a model for how those relations work in the long term, which is something that is obviously not good for the forecasting nature of geopolitics. But at the same time, the fact that we know such reactions exist may help us anticipate some of the moves, the larger moves that happen due to a natural disaster, or at least imagine them.
Allison, I mean, is it fair to say that disasters can have an impact that without them would never have happened, for example? So, you know, a regime might be toppled because of the result of a disaster, because of, you know, the impact on the people and their response, or does it sort of fit within the model that these sorts of the consequences that might come out, like a regime falling, probably would have happened anyway? Can they have that much of an effect that they are, you know, consequential?
Most definitely, they can have an impact on a regime in terms of the pressures that it's facing, its ability to deal with other problems, or its staying power. And it depends a bit on what type of disaster we're talking about, the size, the scope, and also the location and how it impacts a country's economy. So, you know, if we look at, for example, Ethiopia, there is a strong correlation in that country between famine induced by drought over an extended period of time, several years, and regime change. And that's one thing that we're actually keeping an eye on in Ethiopia right now. If we look at Argentina, the same can be true there, because, again, it's been an extended period of drought. And while the food supply is not an issue exactly at this moment, it is impacting their agriculture. And that is a huge source of foreign currency for Argentina, which desperately needs U.S. dollars to keep its economy afloat and run a bunch of different, you know, government programs, subsidies, you name it. And so when you see an event with Argentina being an example where it impacts how many U.S. dollars the country gets in a given year, they can't control it. They desperately need it. That has huge impact on the government and whether or not it's going to be able to manage the social unrest that this will trigger, the extent to which it can keep the government programs running and things like that. So it's not necessarily always going to be the case that when you have a disaster, governments will topple, but it definitely has the opportunity to have those ramifications. And it goes back a little bit to some of the ideas that Antonia was talking about when it comes time for on the economic front, you know, thinking about critical infrastructure or things like that. It's approaching the natural disaster with that mindset of what is the impact that it has on anything critical for regime stability, economic input, economic output, and are any of those core things affected by it? Because if they are, then you need to go through the whole model of deciding, you know, what is the impact going to be and how serious is this for the government?
Well, let's move on to the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. It's been about 3 weeks since that earthquake struck. Antonia, you've been following this. I mean, what sort of political reaction? Well, obviously, it's been a horrendous humanitarian crisis with tens of thousands dead. But what sort of political consequences have we seen so far?
Well, basically, we have seen what usually happens right after a major disaster, which is the population basically trying to find the ones to blame for the natural disaster, even if, you know, you don't necessarily have someone to blame because disasters are just that. they turn towards the way that the crisis is managed, and they turn towards the way that the political leadership has responded once the disaster happened. And with that, they tend to remember the wrongdoings and everything that works badly for them in the country before the disaster happened, which is exactly what happened with Turkey. So basically, we had poor economics. We had already indicators that there may be instability, sociopolitical instability in Turkey. Now the earthquake basically made that chatter, open accusations being the norm for the media, for whatever opinion is being issued outside of government. So we are in the phase that blame is being put on the government right now, politically. At the same time, economically, we do not know exactly what is affected, because even at the moment that I'm speaking, there are aftershocks happening in Turkey. I know this is pretty amazing, and obviously the aftershocks are not that urgent, not urgent, but they are no longer that high on the Richter scale to produce large damage, but they are happening. So the crisis management is also dealing with that, which is why we do not know whatever happens next with regards to how the damages are being taken away from the society, in a sense.
And there's a sense that there's talk that Erdogan and his government perhaps did not do enough to prepare for an earthquake like this, that the buildings weren't built to proper codes and that sort of thing. Is that, are you seeing that? Is there a feeling like that amongst the population?
Yes, that is starting to be talked about. The corruption in the public administration that led to the poor buildings construction, and how the administration basically awarded whatever paperwork was needed for a building to be built, and that sort of thing. Actually, the government has taken steps to check on the constructors, and there were arrests being made, considering the damages produced. And that is kind of the first time that I'm seeing a government, not only the Turkish government, but a government basically reacting to a natural disaster by looking for those to be blamed before the media starts talking about this as a major topic of the day. So this is happening, but the government seemed prepared this time to deal with that.
And I mean, Erdogan, of course, came into power off the back of an earthquake like this, and the response from the public that the government hadn't done enough. And there are elections later in the year. Of course, as you say, we've kind of got a bit of time to figure out what their reaction is going to be and if it's going to be considered good enough by the public. But I mean, what could the long-term consequences of this be?
Well, yeah, exactly. Erdogan knows how to deal with this because he was on the other side when he came to power. And I think that in the next months, we are going to see policies to address the disaster management in a way. However, considering the Turkish economics and the way that the country has dealt with the poor economy so far, it is unlikely that this disaster passes as, something that can be easily solved in the next few months. So Turkey will have repercussions. We are looking at infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. We are looking at buildings. We are looking at a whole area that needs to be supported from a socioeconomic standpoint. So Basically, there are people that no longer have a job, businesses that no longer work for quite some time now. And all this needs to be dealt with on the longer term. Obviously, you would expect, okay, after a few weeks, months, businesses could come online, right? But the clients won't necessarily wait for them to come online. And the supply chain will obviously change because of the way the business world works. We also are not aware of the level of damage that was produced in terms of what exactly are the sectors, how is the energy infrastructure being affected by the natural disaster. All these questions that basically mean one thing. There will be a high cost dealing with all this. And it is a cost that Turkey will need to deal with. And obviously, if when you have a strong economy, a natural disaster is problematic, imagine how it goes when you have a weak economy. This is not exactly what Erdogan looked forward to deal with, or any government, actually.
Allison, I don't know if you want to come in here, but I mean, as Antonia touched on earlier in the podcast, these sorts of disasters, and in particular, we're seeing it with Turkey right now, it allows for lots of international partners and allies such as Sweden to come in and assist the country, which perhaps creates ties or makes assurances where previously there was tension. Are we seeing much of that here? Is this a chance for perhaps Western allies that or Western partners that have perhaps been sidelined by Erdogan to come back into the frame in the minds of the Turkish people?
Absolutely. The thing about humanitarian aid is that it is extremely difficult to criticize anyone offering aid, and it is extremely difficult to refuse humanitarian aid, both because of the general optics and also because of the general need in those types of situations where normally the host country won't be able to necessarily provide all of the resources that are going to be necessary for that crisis management in terms of, clean water supplies and what have you for both the affected population and the remaining population in the rest of the country. And that's why I think you can have this general trend of opening ties in general, where you can see all sorts of different countries, even from Central Asian countries where Turkey's been using cultural ties to try to help out, coming into giving aid to Western Hemisphere and Western European countries sending aid. It really is this opportunity to just kind of come in and see what may come from it afterwards. It's not necessarily going to be a strong bedrock for relations in terms of having this fundamental interest that is undeniable and will bond countries for life. But it is that opportunity where you have that chance to kind of do a bit of a reset, with the case in point being the Sweden negotiations, where you can kind of use that to warm things up again and take a different direction should you so choose.
Well, look, let's move on to our next example. Last year, Pakistan saw terrible, terrible flooding. Millions were displaced. Thousands were killed. It brought tumult to the region. But, I mean, what political consequences have we seen in a country that's already, in a pretty dire political situation? Allison, let's start with you.
As you mentioned, they're in already a politically dire situation, and they did have, I believe, a change of government before the floods occurred. So with the timing of that, you're not necessarily going to see a change in government that closely after, because of the near recency of what we had with the governments coming in. The economic consequences have been outstanding for Pakistan in terms of, they had about $15 billion worth of damages, another $15 billion worth of economic losses. And that is on top of all of the problems they had before this related to infrastructure projects with China, high fuel prices, high electricity prices, high food prices, you name it. And so all of these economic stressors that they had been dealing with prior to the floods suddenly got much, much worse because they had to deal with all of the economic aftermath of the floods, and they're still dealing with that now to this day. So we're seeing that economic consequence really play out in Pakistan more strongly than, say, the political consequences. But over time, again, we will traditionally see economic pressures turning into the political.
And Antonia, I'm particularly interested in what this has done for Pakistan in terms of its relationship with its neighbours. Pakistan, of course, famously allied closely, allied, shall we say, or at least friends with China, one of the only countries, if not the only country that is. I mean, what happened to its relationship with China after these floods?
Okay, well, basically, China has promised to help Pakistan, but obviously China cannot really jump in and help Pakistan because it has its own problems that it needs to deal with, which basically pushed Pakistan to look for help elsewhere. That is basically telling for China's posturing as a regional and even global power. That is also telling for the neighborhood, considering that China is supporting and is supportive of its own interests in, let's say, in the region, even in Afghanistan. It tries to maintain good relationship with the Taliban, for instance, but it cannot really come in and support a partner state like Pakistan on an emergency matter because it has to consider the risk of political instability and economic instability, as it is also dealing with its own potential political instability at home triggered by economic problems.
And I mean, what are the wider consequences of that? I mean, as you say, it's perhaps not exactly the best look for China in its quest to be a kind of regional dominant power, that it can't help, in particular, its most important friend in the area.
Right. Well, the larger consequence is basically the way that we look at China to become a contender for the U.S. Power. It's telling because China wants to get into that role, but obviously has its constraints at home. It's not only about Pakistan, it's also about other elements that we have seen within China and within its proximity. And to see how China reacts with regards to partners and with regards to its goal, it is perhaps very telling how the Belt and Road Initiative project has developed and has kind of stalled with the pandemic and with the economic problems that are that China is seeing, that Beijing is seeing. That is also why Pakistan was not able to get much help, unfortunately.
I would also just add that, when you see a country like China in the relationship that China and Pakistan have, not being able to follow through, it does plant the seed in the Pakistani government of, okay, if we can't rely on China and we can't do this on our own, we need other partners. And it also creates open space for other people to start trying to see, okay, can we fill that void? Can we step in? So we've seen things like the IMF coming in and Pakistan turning more towards the IMF for some of its financial problems, which before they wouldn't because of the contradiction it would have with their relationship with China. We have seen Russia now expressing interest in doing things like hydropower projects in Pakistan, which are along the same lines of the major infrastructure projects that China was interested in doing in Pakistan. And while none of these have really kind of completely ousted China or replaced China, we're now starting to see these reconsiderations emerging as they've lacked some of the follow through or to meet the expectations that this partnership had kind of promised Pakistan.
And Antonia, let me just bring it back quickly to Pakistan itself. I actually want to come back slightly later on to what that sort of international relationship will mean for the future. But for the government itself, it's been accused on multiple fronts that the state didn't learn from the similar floods that happened in 2010. I mean, do you think this is true? Do you think that this is something that we're going to be seeing more of now as more of these sorts of natural disasters occur?
Well, basically, this is, the accusation of not learning much of previous situations, like the flooding situations, is a bit, let's say, shallow because of the fact that we have a somewhat different environment that we're talking about in Pakistan proper and in the world. Let me just briefly tell what I mean by that. First of all, we have had a pandemic that basically has shifted the way the world economics work and obviously has affected each and every country in a different way, considering its own specifics, right? Now, Pakistan has dealt with economic problems before the pandemic has started. And obviously, these were basically turned worse due to the pandemic and also due to the political instability. So the way that the country was managed during the last 5 years has been through crisis management mostly. This basically triggered the economics to become more and more unstable. And as the pandemic started, Pakistan was basically weakened. Now, with the fact that we have all gone through two energy crisis momentums, one during the pandemic and one related to the to the war in Ukraine, basically. Pakistan was also exposed to that because obviously there was, I believe, almost a 20% hike in the energy prices. And that has not stopped there. There was a high inflation that we know has been a phenomenon again for the world economy in general. But for a country like Pakistan, that was felt even harder. Now, with the Pakistani political establishment being unstable and with the poor economics, the flooding only came in to make things worse. And now imagine this in a setting where the demographics is really something wild in terms of, the number of population, the growth rate of the population, and the fact that the critical infrastructure was not built to support that kind of society and that kind of demographic development in time. All this basically accelerated a process of economic crisis that got us into 2023 with another, crisis that was not necessarily related to the flooding per se, but was related to a complex environment that both the government and the country was under. Now, trust is one key element when it comes that needs to be put into context when crises like this happen. And obviously, the population's trust in the government is at the very low bottom at the moment. There is also the role of the military that has gone through sort of a transition recently, and not even the military kind of has the support of the population that it once had. Which means that we're talking about a very vulnerable state, a state that indeed looks to get help from, all partners that it can get help from. it looks at Saudi Arabia, it looks at the United Arab Emirates, and it looks at the IMF primarily to get the money needed to stabilize some of the situation, which is, very much complex and very much vulnerable.
I think just for the sake of time, let's move on to our final example here. Allison, let me come to you because it's your area of particular expertise, which is that the droughts in Argentina have been going on for about 3 years now. Some say that they're the worst in 60 years. I believe the last 4 months of 2022 experienced less than half the annual rainfall for that period, the annual average rainfall for that period. Allison, let's start with the kind of economic agricultural impact of this. Argentina, obviously a big agricultural country. What's the impact been of that?
So the impact is going to be seen primarily with obviously exports, and this is going to impact international markets as well as Argentine finances. The government will ensure that for domestic demand, it has enough supply. And so when there's a situation like this, it will restrict particularly wheat exports so that farmers will not be able to export certain quantities that don't necessarily guarantee first domestic consumption needs. So that's the first thing that we're going to see is that the international market is the one that's going to be taking the hit. And that's just keeping it in mind because in other places, you sometimes can see people trying to take advantage of higher prices of food. And that's just not the case in Argentina ever. They always make sure to have the domestic populations covered before they do any of their exports. The other thing is that the general amount is going to go down, and they have already calculated an estimated $10 billion potentially less in export revenue from the lack of crops that they will be able to export this year. It could be a little bit less than that, but we're talking in the billions here. This is not, a bad crop by any means in terms of a bad season, but like you said, it's been years in the making. Other factors that have been contributing to this, like the war in Ukraine, is the lack of fertilizers at affordable prices. And there's a bit of a loop there as well, because you need the grain exports to get U.S. dollars. At the same time, Argentina needs to import things like fuel for its machinery, fuel for its factories, fertilizer for its crops, and that costs U.S. dollars. And those things all had higher prices over the last year. So as the amount of U.S. dollars became more scarce, the prices went up. The amount that they were able to buy for input materials declined. And so there's a spiraling effect that they're also seeing in terms of crop yields. That's not just because the water supply is lower, but then input materials like fertilizers is also more scarce, and their ability to acquire that will be diminished because, again, they're not going to be exporting enough to have enough U.S. dollars to compensate for that.
I mean, if I were to be extremely blunt, shall we say, droughts, last for a certain amount of time and they end. Things, as you say, are spiraling. What, if any, permanent consequences do you think we'll see from this? So
the permanent consequences are a little bit up in the air in terms of anything related to rainfall, right? Because it is entirely possible that rainfall will resume in some of these areas. What we are going to start seeing, though, are shifts. Some farmers are going to be leaving the market because, again, you need to have your loans and crop expectations to be able to secure those loans. Smaller farmers are going to be getting chased out of the production market there. Their ability to re-enter, I think, is going to be in question. So that's going to be a more long-term lasting effect. I think we're also seeing in neighboring countries like Paraguay that have used the river transport to get their crops out, second guessing things because of the dryness in the river, that they're now going to be making plans for road access to make sure that they can have those out there, and that's a permanent infrastructure decision that they'll be doing in terms of improving what roads they do have and the accessibility for things like that. And then also shoring up domestic supplies, which is a broader trend we've seen even in the pandemic reaction of, can we supply some of these things on our own at a cheaper price so that if there are glitches outside of our environment, we can somehow secure them to better improve our performance? And in this case, it would be in agriculture.
I mean, what are the wider consequences, do you think, for the American hemisphere there? I mean, the geopolitical consequences. Are there relationships that are being torn or stretched because of this?
There's not necessarily relationships that are being torn or stretched. What we're seeing is Argentina is going to miss out on the reorganizing of some of these external trade relationships when it comes to corn, when it comes to wheat, when it comes to soybeans. We've seen the U.S. and Brazil, and to a lesser extent Canada, really step up strong with some of their grain exports. And countries are going to be turning towards some of these other providers that they are perhaps going to see as more stable and in a better environment to be able to meet their needs, both for short-term contracts and also for longer-term contracts, where right now, between the drought, between the government in power, between the financial problems that the country has, people are not going to see Argentina as a reliable partner so much as they did, say 20 years ago. And so they may see themselves missing out on some of these restructurings when people are trying to come up with new trade partners to ensure grain supply, especially in the wake of Russia and Ukraine.
I mean, that sort of message strikes me as quite dire for Argentina in the long term then, in the sense that, they're going to be left out of some of their key markets.
If they can get production back online and have it be plentiful, they could try to recover some of that. But right now, what we're seeing in the world is a period of still higher prices, perhaps not as high as a year ago, but that bonanza of high commodity prices, everybody wants to cash in on that. And one of the reasons why those prices are so high to begin with is because there is that imbalance between supply and demand. Argentina, in some ways, is contributing to that lack of supply, and they're also just not going to be able to bring in as much money over these next couple of seasons as they would had they been able to capitalize on that.
Well, look, one last question for each of you. Looking into the future, climate change means that we're seeing a lot more of these sorts of events now. Of course, things like earthquakes, and we were even going to talk about the volcanic eruption in Iceland a few years ago that shut down half of Europe's airports. That's obviously not going to be affected by this, but things like flooding, cyclones, tornadoes, big freezes, that sort of thing, that they are seemingly increasing, and according to predictions, will continue to do so. What effect do you then think this will have on wider geopolitics and relationships around the world? I mean, is this something that is now going to be needed to be factored in more to the analysis of geopolitics? Antonia, let me start with you.
Basically, we are going with the theory that there has always been a shift in climate. There has always been, there have always been natural disasters to deal with. So we are not necessarily new to the phenomenon that we need to include in our theories, only that I would say that currently we need to expect an acceleration of the way that human societies react to the potential of disasters and the potential of changes that take place rapidly or slowly. What do I mean by that? We are no longer living in a world where we are disconnected as nation states or communities. The fact that we have the internet, the fact that we can talk to one another no matter where we live, also facilitates information and panic to go from one point to another way faster than it would have gone, let's say, 50 years ago. That means that there is a political agenda for all these things that drive change, like climate change, like technological progress that could be associated in one way or another with pollution and the effect that the human being has to the planet and that sort of thing. So we obviously need to be more aware of the feelings and of the platforms, the political platforms that are created upon these feelings when we are dealing with phenomenon that would, normally be regarded as, natural phenomenon, natural disasters that have randomly happened throughout the history. Nowadays, there aren't just that. We do expect more, and we do take on more of the responsibility for why they happen, which is a different kind of way of looking at the world. But in the same time, it is just us being aware of politics and the way that the political agenda is being shaped. So yes, it is our responsibility to regard politics as part of geopolitics, right? And in that sense, there's nothing really changed, fundamentally changed.
Allison, what do you think?
I think where I see this also going in terms of how it could get geopolitical dimensions is with technology and kind of competition surrounding that. So with this added awareness that Antonia discussed, and with this added expectation of we need to be able to deal with these things, we need to come up with solutions for them, there's going to be a lot of impetus behind technologies that can help do just that. And I'm thinking, for example, drought-resistant seeds or, more efficient fertilizers. If you want to talk agriculture, there's going to be ways for, water management or flood prevention in terms of retaining water, better structures built for buildings, coastal technologies for any type of, tsunami or erosion of water or flooding that could come on the coastal areas as opposed to rainfall inland or something along those lines. So there's a lot of ways that I think we're going to start seeing people trying to control more of the impact that these events could have on infrastructure, populations, and the economy, and that competition kind of picking up for that, because those that are going to be better capable of mitigating the impact of future disasters or problems that they have, one, they're going to suffer less damages, and that's going to also put them in a relatively better standing than those that would suffer the same problems but have worse consequences because they weren't able to mitigate that impact as well as others.
Well, look, I think that's probably a really good place to wrap it up. Antonia and Allison, as always, fantastic to have you on Podcast Plus. We will be back again next month, but until then, you take care and we'll see you soon.